The following stories about the many assassination attempts on Saint John Bosco's life are taken from a book by Dr. Charles Despini called Don Bosco, a sketch of his life and miracles. It's one of the most amazing chapters on his life I've ever read. The Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. I'm just going to briefly outline the tenets of the Waldensian heretics mentioned in the stories so that you have a profile of the assassins in this episode. They rejected most of the 7 sacraments. The confession of sins did not require a priest, in their opinion. They did not administer baptism to infants, but waited till the person was much older for some reason. They denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, the virginity of Our Lady, the notion of purgatory, and of prayers offered for the dead. As early as 1850, Don Bosco had planned to stem the rising tide of heretical publications with a series of popular booklets entitled Lecture Catholicae, Catholic Readings. The publication was very successful, and it wasn't long before 2 ruffians came to the oratory to warn Don Bosco to stop publishing Lecture Catholicae. They offered him 4,000 lire as a bribe and said that there was more where that came from if he would only publish books they commissioned. Don Bosco politely but flatly refused. "Gentlemen," he said, "I get your message clearly, but let me tell you quite frankly that when truth is at stake, I fear no one. I became a priest to serve my church and save souls, particularly the souls of the young. I started Lecture Catholicae for this very reason, and I intend to continue this publication and do everything in my power to enhance its popularity." At this point, one of them said, "You're making a terrible mistake." This thought was echoed by his friend as they both stood up. The facade of their fine manners had completely disappeared. "Yes, a terrible mistake," the minister repeated. "Your refusal is an insult. Aren't you afraid of what could happen to you? When you leave this room, can you count on returning?" Don Bosco replied, "As long as we live, we priests are happy to work for God. If we should die while carrying out our duties, we would regard such a death as our greatest fortune and glory. Spare yourselves the trouble of threatening me. Don't make yourselves look ridiculous." And he had them escorted out of the room by one of his huskier oratory boys. Under political pretexts, the Waldensians aroused the lower classes by spreading false and perfidious accusations against the Catholic clergy, and consequently, it wasn't safe for a minister of God at that time to go through certain parts of Turin. Besides this, Don Bosco had aroused much hatred by establishing his oratory at Valdogo. Here assembled gamblers, drunkards, and all kinds of evildoers, as well as strolling musicians, showmen, and every species of vagabond, men ready in the use of the knife, who recoiled at nothing to prevent the invasion of what they considered their domain. This state of things explains in a measure why they were so furious against the poor priest. One day, when he was in the chapel surrounded by his children, to whom he was teaching the catechism, a shot was fired at him through an open window. The ball passed between his arm and his chest, tearing his soutane and flattening itself against the wall. The terrified children rose in tumult, but Don Bosco, impassible and smiling, said, "If the Blessed Virgin had not made him miss his aim, he would certainly have hit me, but he didn't reach me." Then, looking at his torn soutane, he said, "Oh, poor soutane, I'm very sorry for what has happened to you, for you're the only one I possess." On another occasion, when in the midst of his children, an insane man rushed at him with a large knife, and it was only by a miracle that he escaped to his room. One evening, the doorbell rang at the oratory, and someone begged Don Bosco to come as quickly as possible to administer the sacraments to a woman in the neighborhood who was dying. It was a very dark night, and as the father had recently escaped being killed, there were objections made to his going out. But Don Bosco, having declared his determination to go to the sick woman, remonstrance was in vain. But 4 students accompanied him to protect him in case of need. This little group came to a rather isolated house, and 2 of the young men remained outside, while the other 2 went up with Don Bosco to the door of the room, which he entered alone. As soon as he came in, 4 stalwart fellows arose and wished him good day in a tone which they tried to make very gracious. But Don Bosco observed their repulsive appearance, and that they were all armed with clubs, the size of which was not reassuring. He approached the bed of the supposed sick woman. She looked very well, and had a singularly bright color for one who was dying. "Well, my good woman, do you want to make your confession?" he asked. "Certainly I do," she replied in a far from feeble voice. "But first, that old dotard, that rascal there, my brother-in-law, must beg my pardon," and she began to pour forth a torrent of abuse. "You hold your tongue, you miserable wretch," shouted one of the men, who, with a backward motion of his hand, threw the only candle on the floor and extinguished it, thus leaving the room in perfect darkness. At the same time, Don Bosco received a blow from a club which would have felled him had it not glanced off his shoulder. With his usual presence of mind, he seized a chair and raised it over his head. The blows fell like hail on this improvised helmet, which protected him. He was thus able to reach the door, and putting his hand on the latch, he threw the chair at his assailants, and opening the door, joined the two young men who awaited him outside. All this was done so quickly that for a moment they were motionless with astonishment. When they reached the street, the young men were terrified to see Don Bosco covered with blood. But fortunately, the wound he received was not a serious one. While he was protecting his head with the chair, a blow from a club cut his left thumbnail off. It was the only time the assassins had ever drawn blood. There are so many stories of assassination attempts on Saint John Bosco's life, but divine providence preserved him, and he continued to publish Lecture Catholicae in opposition to the Waldensian heretics. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you'd like to hear one of the best saint stories, just click on this link above me here. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.